Jesu ducis memoria, dans vera cordis gaudia.
Gregorian chant. Yes, it's certainly been revived, especially I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a great revival of it, where people recognize it and they have some familiarity with it and also an attraction to it at some level, or a curiosity.
Sed super me omnia, eius ducis presentia.
This is a really interesting phenomenon. Since the early 1990s, we've seen peaked interest in Gregorian chant and really sacred music in general.
Nil canitur suavius, nil lauditur iucundius, nil cogitatur dulcius, quam Iesus Dei filius.
It all sort of began with a very, very successful album in the early 1990s that was simply called Chant. And this chant album was an incredible commercial success for the record company that put it out, and people became interested in it. And then you would start to hear Gregorian chant as samples in popular music. You'd start to hear it in film soundtracks, things like that, where Gregorian chant became part of sort of a popular consciousness of spiritual. And so Gregorian chant became popular with all kinds of people, with all kinds of belief systems. But I think at that point, members of the church started to recognize that this has intrinsic value and that this is our proper music for our liturgy, and that movement of recovery of this material, I think, started at that point when it was recognized more broadly as a tremendous treasure, which of course the church, and certainly at the Second Vatican Council, this was reiterated, has always postulated.
For any of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s and who have come back to the faith, we've realized that there were many things that we were missing from our own education as Catholics growing up that included the sacred music that we missed out on, the Gregorian chant that we missed out on.
It always grows and then recedes to arc the phrase.
There was a certain amount of forgetfulness about this great tradition, particularly in the years that followed the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council. There was a period of focusing on what was new in the liturgy, and that in turn led to a kind of forgetting of what was old and ancient and perennial in the liturgy. That was also partly fed by the fact that the language of the Gregorian chant had always been Latin. And it takes time to adapt this incredibly complex body of music into a usable form, for example, in the vernacular liturgy. So since that time, we've seen a growth of interest in singing chant in English, for instance, which I think has been part of this recovery process. And what's beautiful about that, I think, is encountering this music in English in many ways begins to attune your ear to the older tradition of singing this music in Latin, and so that there is a reconnection, a re-establishing continuity with our ancient traditions there. So I think we've seen a real revival in the last 20 years or so in this respect. I think the use of Gregorian chant is a relatively uncommon feature in the modern American liturgical experience to see Gregorian chant being used in the liturgy. However, there are pockets of excitement about this music. I think many of the cathedrals throughout the country cultivate this kind of music, and there needs to be some measure of leadership, and I think there is a growing number of younger church musicians for whom this is becoming more and more a part of their spiritual and musical formation, and I think there is a genuine increase. As a university professor, I have seen a heightened awareness among young people coming in about this repertoire, and so I can only conclude that there is a broadening interest in this music in the parishes.